For the oral history collections of the Fashion Institute of Technology and for the oral history of the school itself, this will be an interview with Emanuel Weintraub. The date is January 24th, 1985. The interviewer is Mildred Finger. Tell me, Mr. Weintraub, what year were you graduated and what was your major?
1947 Industrial Management.
Then you were among the first graduates, right?
Yes.
And the first graduating class, I think, was in 46.
Right.
So that put you into the second graduating class.
Right.
And you were an industrial management major.
Yes.
How'd that happen? How'd that come about? Because that was a very, I would think, somewhat unusual thing for a young person to be interested in majoring in. Tell us something about your own background, where you were born and when. And
Well, I was born in New York City in the Bronx in 1928, just prior to the Depression.
which is a pretty significant thing, yes, to have as your...
Right, the Depression influenced my mentality and my thinking very heavily because it was a period where poverty was no shame because everybody had it, and you understood what minimum existence was, and so you became very highly motivated out of sheer necessity.
What did your father do?
My father was an entrepreneur. He was a jobber of upholsterer's supplies.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be the inner materials that went inside upholstered furniture. And in those days, a decorator was not someone who did your apartment, but rather one who reupholstered your couch or your sofa or made your drapes. Physically did that work and selected. So he and his two brothers had a business called Weintraub Brothers, which was a minimal, marginal business, but I guess you would say a rousing success because it survived during the Depression and they were able to feed their families.
Did you ever have any temptation to go into his business? Was that any thought in your head?
Yes, I did, but we had different attitudes about business, and so that was a short-lived affair.
What do you mean by different business attitudes? In what way?
Well, my father was a very satisfied type, and I was a very dissatisfied type.
In other words, you really wanted to grow the business more probably than he did, is that?
Right, it's a different focus.
Mm-hmm. And so you went to elementary school in the Bronx?
Yes, and then I went to, in those periods in New York City, people moved around a lot for economic reasons, and so I went to elementary school in the Bronx. Then I never went to elementary school in the Bronx because by the time I was ready for elementary school, we were living with my grandmother, who was a very important influence on my life. She was an entrepreneur. She had a juvenile carriage store on 147th Street and Amsterdam Avenue, and she was illiterate except that she could write her name to sign checks, which was a very...
Yes, had she come from Europe herself?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
She was she ruled with an iron hand, but she was a lady who was, with all of that structure, very liberal-minded. So her one daughter is a graduate of Fordham Law School and died as a sitting judge in the days when women did not do anything but have children and run their homes. So her daughters were all business and career-minded back in the 30s.
Oh. And were you the only son?
I have a younger brother.
You have a younger brother, right. And so there you were. You got out of elementary school, and you went to high school where?
Went to high school, George Washington High School in Upper Washington Heights.
Right. And then what brought you to FIT, or to what was
Well, would you like a, which story would you like? Would you like a, you turn this off because I,
I had just asked how you came to FIT.
came to FIT, heard about it from a friend that it was a new school starting up. Its attraction to me is that if you got in, it was going to be free, and my parents could not afford to send me to a school that charged tuition.
Mm-hmm. You did not have any idea while you were in high school, for example, of what you might be wanting to do
There
as
was
a...
no one in our family that had any connection with the apparel or sewing products industries or anything related to that.
Mm-hmm. So you had just heard about FIT, and it was a free school, and...
Place to get an education beyond what.
Because you had already gone to high school,
Oh yeah.
and you were graduated from high school, so
Yes.
that this was going to be an extra year or 2 years or whatever it was.
Right.
And what did you study?
Studied industrial management and decided to buckle down to work and was awarded a scholarship after my first, sometime I guess the first semester. And the scholarship meant a cash stipend in addition to tuition, which was very, very helpful.
But I thought you said FIT was free.
It was free.
It was.
And then this was cash on
In
top
addition,
of it. And
right,
if you won a
right.
scholarship, then you got money
Mm-hmm.
to sustain you,
Right.
car fare and whatever.
But you didn't live down at the school, of course, since there were no
Hey,
facilities.
Oh, it was in 2 floors
Yeah.
of a high school, as you know.
Right, yes. And so it was in 2 floors of the Negro Trades High School, wasn't it? And so you commuted back and forth every day to your parents' home, right? And in industrial management, what kind of courses did you take? And what kind of faculty did you have?
Well, I thought that we had a good faculty. In retrospect, I think the courses were very well thought out. The courses that we took were obviously industrial management and engineering courses.
Relating to the garment industry, or production,
Well,
or not?
when you get into that kind of statement, these courses are all that would be taught in retrospect now.
Mm-hmm.
They would follow the same format no matter where they would be taught, and the only difference that would be is that your case study material would be geared to one industry. So if you were taking this at Case Western Reserve, so they might have a case study about an electric motor facility.
Mm-hmm.
We had a case study about a shirt facility.
I see.
When you study raw materials, we're studying fabric and knitting and that kind of thing relative to the soft goods industries. And then your academic courses were pretty classic English and sociology and philosophy and history of art and that sort of thing. And it was, considering that it was a 2-year school, it was very intensive. I don't recall how many hours we put in a day, but they were long days. It was not your 16 hours of classroom a week. It was a lot of time. If my memory serves me right.
Yes, if your memory serves you right, you studied...
But you can check that. I'm sure those records are available.
Right. But in your own experience, what kinds of courses did you find the most helpful?
Each in hindsight, each in their own way was helpful. Now, there were a couple of courses that I recognized were very poorly taught, and I went to NYU to study those.
What were they?
Motion study and time study. I had the great good fortune to study with Dr. David Porter
At NYU.
At NYU, who was one of the great names in the field who had done. He, at the time he was teaching me, he was a man in the 60s, but he as a young man had worked with the Gilbreths. They would be known to you. They're the people with Cheaper by the Dozen.
Right.
They were the people who really organized the field of work simplification and motion analysis. Fred W. Taylor, around the turn of the century, also another great name. But this Dr. Porter had done it, so he was very influential. And then I guess I felt I wasn't getting, that they weren't working as hard enough, so I went to City College at night and took some
While
other
you were at
courses.
FIT?
Yeah, I was either going to NYU or I guess I got I was moving.
Right.
As a boy, I was a product of what's known as the RA system in New York City, Rapid Advance. And so by the time I
With
wasn't...
seventh grade in 1 year and eighth grade in
Yeah.
1 year. Oh, no, eighth
Some-
grade in 1 year and ninth grade in 1 year. I
In
think.
any event, so
Something like
when
that.
I graduated high school, I wasn't 17, I was still 16.
Sure.
So I had great energy, and I fairly well rounded my. I got the courses that I felt that were inadequate at FIT elsewhere.
When you say inadequate, were you beginning already to think in terms of a much higher level of achievement than would be made possible to you by the level at which those courses were being taught? Is
So I
that-
just felt those courses were inadequate. They were just. I mean,
You were
I guess I
interested in the subject, but they didn't offer you enough.
They were
mat-
they were taught by one very bright. They were taught by people who were bright, but just they just did not do, in my opinion, a good job of teaching the material.
Did they have academic backgrounds or did they have industry backgrounds? Are you aware?
Well,
Were you aware then?
these two, people who taught the course were very well qualified in the course. They just did not, in my opinion, do a good job teaching that material at that time. And my father was good enough to give me the money to go and
To supplement those things, either at NYU or at City.
right.
When you were finished at FIT, were you getting an associate degree at that point, or was
No.
that not yet accorded?
No.
So you had a certificate of some
Yes.
kind. And did you then go on to a 4-year college? No. So what was your next step after the schooling that you
I
got?
went to work at the Lily of France Corset Company.
Oh, so you did go into the industry.
Oh yeah, I went to the industry.
On the production side.
Yes, as a plant engineer,
Hmm.
and
At that time, were there facilities in New York or
the
New Jersey?
facilities were in 1115 Broadway.
Mm-hmm.
And I had the good fortune to have as a supervisor a very bright man who is a friend of mine to this day, a fellow by the name of George Knight, who was
KNIGHT.
KNIGHT, very bright guy, a classic industrial engineer at Columbia University. Subsequently went on to get a law degree, very bright guy. And so he gave me a lot of good grooming. And
Was the family still very much involved in Lily of France? You don't know. You didn't deal
yes,
with them.
it was something that the one thing that happened to me at Lily of France is I had the opportunity to do the original work on a product that still exists to this day, which is called the Enhance, which was a weight control garment or figure control garment with a diamond. And any event, so that was
Yeah. And how long did you stay at Lily of France?
about 8 or 9 months.
Mm-hmm.
a
And
year.
then from there?
From there, I went to a company called Kaylon. They make
How do you spell that? Do you remember?
Kaylon. They made something called Tommy's Pajamas.
Uh-huh.
And I went to live in Baltimore, Maryland, and then Stanton, Virginia. They had facilities in both of those places. That was my first experience with a out of New York manufacturing facility, and
Was this a children's wear a product? Was this
this was pajamas,
Mhm.
men's and women's
Right.
pajamas.
Okay. I just don't know the name of the
then,
firm. So.
Then from there, I went to work at Goldsmith Brothers in Allentown, Pennsylvania. They made handbags.
Mhm.
And there I was hired to be the chief industrial engineer. And there was a consulting firm called George H. Elliott and Company. I guess I always wanted to be in consulting. And they were doing the consulting, and I had a chance to work with their engineers. And
But you worked directly for Goldsmiths?
Yes.
Yes, not for the consulting
No,
company.
and the idea was that when the consulting program was over, I would take take on the responsibility of that particular assignment. Then, from that point, I went to work for also a year. I went to work for a company called the Standard Garment Company in um, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Columbia, Pennsylvania, actually, to be precise. And was there a year.
And in each case, you lived right in
We
the...
lived out of town. And there I was in charge of engineering for about 5 factories. And one of the problems that you have when you're young and full of energy and full of ideas is that you want to reorganize existing companies. And the problem with that is that management and ownership resist ideas from youthful people because they say they don't have experience. So that brings on the inevitable clash, and it is management that votes its votes, and you find out that you're without a job. So at that point, the Korean War was underway, and I enlisted in the regular army infantry for the Korean War. I was too young for World War II, so this
Yes, right, I was just figuring, just calculating.
just
right.
caught my sense of adventure, and was honorably discharged in 1952, and at that point decided that I would go into my own practice.
Now, what kind of, as a consultant, what kind of consulting were you planning to do and what do you do?
Well, what do I do, or what was I planning to do?
Both, if they're different.
Well, what our firm does, I have a firm under
Right.
the name of Emmanuel Weintraub Associates Incorporated, and our firm today is a company that provides services in the areas of industrial engineering and manufacturing is one area. The other is in organization and organization structure, and the third is in marketing and market research.
And you operate primarily in the fashion-related industries, is that...
I would say that about 70% of our practice is in the sewn products industries, and the rest is in government studies, the hotel industry, light metalworking, a wide range of other fields.
which might represent 30% of your
Right.
endeavors. Okay. As an FIT graduate, did you ever have the occasion to report back to the school and mention to anybody that you felt that there were things that they should have strengthened in their curriculum? Did you ever have any kind of relationship like that with anybody there?
Oh, a number of years ago, Marv Feldman put me on a panel that had to do with the report with regard to going to 4 years. 4 years. And I was happy to serve on that. And
How did you know him, or how did he know you? How did he find you?
we found Marvin. I've always kept in close contact with the various presidents of FIT.
Oh, you have? Then you have
Sure.
had contact
Sure.
with them. That's what I was interested in knowing.
And we do seminars, and
Your
when-
company.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And so early in his tenure at FIT, he was good enough to be a luncheon speaker at some of the seminars that we ran.
Hmm. Well, have you made suggestions to them at any point about what additional courses they might give the students in the areas in which you were
I would say
trained
not recently, but
in years
in,
gone
in
by?
in the prior period, and then at least in the management department, we've got many good friends like Roland Kahn and Jack Fish and Fred Golden, and so
Right.
it's not that distant from the school.
Right. No, I just wondered if there had ever been dialogues in which you could express what you thought about the various departments and how they could be strengthened so that they would give their students greater depth or greater breadth.
Never really, I would say never really been formally asked.
Hmm.
So you,
So you've never reviewed the curriculum as it is now constituted, for example. During the days when you were going there, how many students were there approximately?
it was very small. I couldn't do that.
In your own department? In your own one?
Me.
You?
I was the graduating class of my year.
In your own particular...
Yeah, it eventually dwindled down to about one.
So that, well now, there have been a lot of people, have there not, who have gone into production in the garment industry.
Yeah.
Through what course or what curricula do you
Does this
think?
tie into what I was telling you something anecdotal, that in my year that we may have had 6 entering and 1 graduating.
Well, you hadn't mentioned 6 entering, that's why I was curious
Yeah.
too. You hadn't mentioned any numbers at all.
Or 8 or something like
Yeah,
that.
right.
It's a matter of record. But if my memory serves me right, I was the lone survivor of the class of February 47.
Right. But
in-
would people ordinarily who want to become production executives take the program that you had taken?
You mean
It was the
today or then?
then. Was the curriculum intended for people who are going into production?
Oh, yeah.
It was, but you don't know of any people in your year, since you were the only graduate, who were...
Well, I knew people who either were, a year ahead of me or a year behind me. I knew some of those people, and many of them went on to be very, very successful.
All right, after we finish, I'm going to ask you if you can give me some names, because I'm terribly interested in who people who went into other than design or other than into retailing as merchandising as the years went on. If you had some advice to give to FI students of today, what would you tell them that you think they ought to do, or how to specialize, or should they specialize, or what should they do? I feel there's no reason why, I mean, now that it's a 4-year school, there might be some who will go on. There's also no reason why some might not want to go on to other kinds of graduate work, if that was what you thought was significant.
No, I don't think I would have any particular advice. The FIT turns out a decent student, and if they're motivated to go there, then they couldn't go to a nicer school.
You did not know many of your contemporaries there, I assume, from what you've said. I just wondered if, what kind
No,
of
I knew-
backgrounds
I knew-
people came from.
I don't follow what you mean. I obviously knew the people who were there. I was
Well,
friendly.
yeah, but if you were one person in a class which was graduate, which remained there, I don't know how well you might have gotten to know them as friends, and I'm interested in knowing what the population of the school consisted of then. Were there kids whose families were in the business, in the ready-to-wear business? Was it totally unrelated to people who were in the industry? Do you have any sense of that at all?
No, I couldn't tell you that. I really didn't hear too many people tell me that their fathers had, in retrospect, I'm trying to think back, I don't recollect people telling me that they knew, that they were in that business.
Well, it's interesting, after all, even though ILGW has lost a lot of workers in the past 10 or 15 years, it is interesting that the industry has survived as long as it has, and that companies have not necessarily had offspring go into the businesses, although many have had a second generation. But obviously people keep going into the business. And so I'm just curious to know whether the demographics of the school reflect any particular population, or
You mean
Just-
currently?
well, at any time that you're familiar
Yeah, I
with.
would say that really to get an accurate reflection of that motor vehicle, you're going to get that from the school records. It's a lot easier than I'm going to tell you. They probably have it on computer. Somebody could have a task to do that, to check the records, but instead of attempt to respond to that today.
Do you have children?
Yes.
Have they had any desire to go into the field in which you are?
My daughter works for our company.
She does.
Yeah.
And what was her training?
Marketing, Syracuse,
Mm-hmm.
and she's been with our firm 2 years after 2 years of prior industry
Which
experience.
industry did she go into?
She was with Sharp, Japanese photocopier company,
Mm-hmm.
and then she was with a telephone company.
A telephone servicing company?
No, telephone companies that market telephone systems.
Uh-huh, right, yes. And she was never interested, really, I gather, in any of the fashion-related industries in the area. Mm-hmm.
She's a very good consultant. She works on different consulting assignments, primarily in marketing and in organization.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
she has worked in some studies, manufacturing oriented, where what she had learned in school, she could be of assistance to other consultants on the assignment.
Mm-hmm.
But her primary concentration is marketing and organization.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there are skills that are not being taught to FIT students today that you know about? I mean, in your recent experiences when you've been part of seminars with Marvin, where Marvin Feldman, for example, spoke.
That's going way back. Now, the seminars that we ran with the industry, and Marvin was just a speaker.
Just one
of
other speaker,
speakers.
right? Uh-huh. So you're
Now,
not
we
really.
employ some FIT people, and what I don't know is, in hindsight, whether we are being unfair. We expect them to get out of school and come in with 10 years experience, and of course it's not. It's not. I don't think there's any. I think they're doing a fine job, really. There are things.
How about reading and writing?
Classic problem. No one can read and write.
Yeah, right.
There's nothing to do with FIT. That has to do with people cannot write, and consulting, that is very important.
I know this.
The
Yes.
ability to express a thought cogently and convey what your true meaning is.
Mm-hmm.
Very difficult. But I would say I wouldn't just point the finger at FIT. I would say you pick up any newspaper today, and from the New York Times to the Wall Street Journal, and you say if that writer was working for our office, that report would never get by, because it's very difficult.
Would you edit it or just not take it?
Well, our reports, I edit many of our reports to make sure that they have a clarity to them, that they convey the correct thought, because consulting and management consulting, you are conveying complex interpretations of data and the significance of that data, so that management can take an action on it.
When you talk about one component in your business being organization
I'm
structure,
15 minutes past the break.
all right, organization structure, do you mean, would you, for example, go into, well, just to give you an example of a fashion business, go into an apparel manufacturing firm and help them to reconstruct things so that their production facilities, let's say, are moved from here to there? Are you technically are you knowledgeable about that kind of business?
That's what but that's not in response to organization. Organization, we will go into a company, any kind of company, and assess from the top down. From one of our clients, major public company, one division we went into, the chairman of the board wanted us to assess that company from the president to the shipping dock. And so you do a organization analysis, which we call top-down, bottom-up. Perception from the top down, perception from the bottom up, to determine whether the organization is in harmony with itself in terms of its own functioning. And then once you gather that data, we use many other input and gather data and devices, we will then look at what we feel will be a true functioning organization. because work in a company, you have pyramidal structure, which is classic pyramid.
Yes.
The chief is on top of the building. But the way businesses really work, or institutions work, that determines who can hire and fire and who gets the corner window. But the way work takes place, you find that groups form and reform. So you may have the president's assistant is working with two vice presidents, and that assistant is really the nominal leader of that group for that particular task to take place. And then that group breaks, and then a new group reforms later in the day to do some other sets of tasks. So the pyramidal hierarchical is essentially the military function, and we think in terms of something we call a snowflake or nucleus concept, where you've got one individual in the center and then all of these molecules around it. And these groups form and reform, and then if you get into something more complex group of tasks, these outer parts will impact on each other.
Sounds to me as though you've done a lot of innovative conceptual thinking. I don't know where you have learned that, because I don't think did you learn it anywhere? I don't think so.
We've just been reading the experts and finding out that half the time they're wrong. We did.
And then coming up with your
in
own
the
ideas.
70s, we did a study that got a lot of notoriety on work, blue collar blues, if you remember that. And our studies showed that the four elements. I think we have to wrap. We did a study in the 70s in response to the subject of blue collar blues, that workers are oriented, disaffected because they had so-called dull, boring jobs and so on and so forth. And our office did a study at its own cost and expense. It was national in scope, where we said, well, the most confining job that we can think of is a sewing machine operator. Confined to that 3.5-foot table, working all day long, sewing on pockets or stitching left flies or hemming cuffs or whatever. And so we interviewed from New Bedford to Dallas. In New Bedford, the interviews were in both Portuguese and English. In Dallas, they were in Spanish, and all types of industries. And what we found is that, at least at that point in time, that those workers were basically interested in the economic issues and more leisure time. Job security, comparable pay, leisure time, and more pay. And all the other issues ranked very, very low. We had a very complex questionnaire. We had true false, which tested against multiple choice, and then we had written, got a big
Essays, yeah.
And it was in the Times, it was on the radio, the British equivalent of Fortune came over to interview us. Anyway, make a long story short, so the conclusion that we came to is that the social scientists are attaching their views to people who don't necessarily share those views. Now, we haven't studied this recently, but every time you get a recession, you find out that what people are interested in is a job. And the idea of openness, communication, worker participation, good companies always had that.
Since you mentioned the sewing machine operator, was that a happenstance that you used that as an illustration, or have you had some contact with the industry, with the sewing, with apparel?
Oh, we have 70% of our practice is in sewn products.
When you say sewn products, though, that includes a lot of things which are not necessarily apparel or
home furnishings, but it's the same. It's the same handbags or leather belts.
Well, then I wonder if I can ask you a broader question. Do you have any feeling about such things as offshore production? Do you have any opinions on that?
They get published regularly.
Well, I know they do, but would you put a little bit of it on here? Because I am fascinated that you obviously are such a conceptual thinker. You know, that's not usual in our business.
Well, I'm in the consulting field.
Right,
I'm
I
not
know.
in the production field. So
Right.
the we currently, Mildred, have about 40-odd% import impact in apparel, and you're competing against countries that manufacture money, in the sense of, you think in terms of Red China. Red China is paying their workers in a domestic currency, which is totally unrelated to the hard currency that you as a tourist bring and buy things with. And if they need another $1 billion for their exchange account, they're just going to make that many more shirts or whatever, and the cost is secondary. Because those workers can't exchange their money for hard currency. And the same is true in most of the restricted countries of the world. And so if you compound that with the overvalued dollar, you find that our imports are very cheap. And what all of that means, boiling it all down, is that the fiber, textile, apparel complex right now is at extreme risk, unless we can find ways to slow the rising tide of imports, and it is moving tremendously. You had in 1984 a move. In other words, we had projected in late '83 or early '84 that if the rate of imports continued, you'd get 29%, but the rate didn't continue. It skyrocketed, and you got over 40%. And so you would just have mill and plant closings. So it is something that has to be seriously considered.
If offshore production continues at that level, then the nature of the industry in this country would appear to be largely the design aspect,
Marketing and selling.
right?
Absolutely.
So that's
And
what
so
we'll
our
be.
practice in the last 5 or 6 years has been accelerating its change to reflect that.
Right.
And if you think that, if you take an industry such as the handbag industry, which according to its executive director is now 90% import impacted. So for every 10 handbags that you sell, 9 are made outside the United States, 1 is made here. So these are serious.
And the shoe industry too, right?
Shoes. And but then you think about how the consumer feels. Everybody loves Japanese television sets and Korean TV sets, and nobody is really feeling particularly remorseful about the fact that their TV sets are no longer made by RCA in Camden, New Jersey.
But as you see it, it would appear as though the elements that will remain in this country in the fashion-related industries are the design, the marketing, the selling, right?
Yeah.
Pretty much, and the distribution, I suppose. Yeah.
Oh, sure. But as you lose production, when you lose a sufficient amount of production, it accelerates the further loss of production. And as production moves to different sites, then the product marketing will eventually follow behind it. So when you abandon, as we have, consumer electronics manufacturing in the United States, we now find that our largest marketers of consumer electronics are Sanyo and Sony and Panasonic, the firms that originally manufactured under contract for American firms. And I think that we will in time see a wresting away of the design and marketing and into stronger hands from foreign firms. So you are really talking about the eventual, over what period of time I don't know, but I think you could look forward to that, because history is a great...
You didn't finish the sentence. The eventual what?
The eventual dismemberment of this industry as we know it. History is a great predictor of the future. And so if you look at other industries like electronics, the electronics was dominated by American firms. It's no longer so, because once you know how to do it, you then build on that. And certainly the Japanese designers are making an impact in the United States. Whether this will totally happen because apparel is such a fragmented industry remains to be seen.
But it's a possibility.
You've got to say it's a strong possibility.
Right.
I mean, you have to weave into this the impact of electronics, teleconferencing, the ability to wire your patterns across the world, the ability of jetting your samples, of wiring your patterns. You're familiar with the technology of computer grading and marking.
Oh,
are you?
absolutely.
Okay. I don't know. Are you in this industry, or what do you do? You all this then. You go and you say the marketplace can, with the system of electronics, you could conceivably put your patterns up on any one of the number of computer grading and marking systems, wire it over. Within minutes they've got it. Bango, they're sewing up those samples, and Zumo, it's back.
The only thing you can hope for is that the creative element can't be transmitted that fast.
But what's happening is that the creative ideas are that transmittable. So, I didn't know who you were. Now I know who you are, so I can talk with you about this. The creativity. You want to go to San Francisco? You grab a plane and you run. You want to go to Hong Kong? It's important. You can jump a Concorde, or you're there in a day. You can takes a little out of you, but you can really be there and back in a week.
Right. Well, I thank you very much. This has been very interesting.
Give me a business card.
The one thing you didn't tell me is that the reason you're a member of the NYU Club, as I am too, is
as follows. Back about 25 or 28 years ago, I got an opportunity to become a member of the faculty of NYU. And so I taught both in Washington Square and up on the engineering campus. And my office was down on Lower Broadway. I belonged to the faculty club. When I moved my office uptown, I got out of the faculty club and joined the NYU Club. And here I've served 2 terms on the board of directors of the club, and that's it.
very good. Okay,
So
thank
much.
you a lot.